There we are.
So welcome everyone. So day one, number 3 of our Sunday service. Today what we're going to talk about is philosophy. So it's a little bit of a deep subject. But we're going to get into a little bit of how do we come up with a framework as humanists to think about our world and our place in it. And then we'll get into a little bit of ethics and morality, and then a little bit of kind of the things like the golden rule and why that makes sense. And then this will be part one of a two-part piece. The second piece will focus more on social ethics, society, and some of the more complex ideas of how you build a community with a consistent set of rules or ethics that allow us to kind of meet our goal, which is to advance humanity and to put ourselves in a better place. And so we'll talk about some of the fundamental pieces of that today. So one of the things I threw out there, one of the links was to a story by Isaac Asimov called The Last Question. This is a really interesting piece of writing because it helps provide perspective, one that might be a little different than what we've heard from some different books, like the Bible. So The Last Question talks about society advancing kind of past where we are today and coming up with this computer that's supposed to figure out questions and answers for us. It's called Multivac. I won't get into the details, but over generations and eons pass and stars begin to die out, they've asked this computer and the different iterations of it, how do you reverse entropy, right? How do you reverse the stars dying? And it continues to respond with not enough information for an adequate answer. Until almost all the stars have died out, all of the humans have sort of become one in some sort of unified mental group. And the final computer answers the question of how you reverse entropy. And the computer, unified with this everything that is human, says, "Let there be light." And so I mentioned that to start because when you really look at where we came from and how we came to be, whether it's the Big Bang or people who think a God or a force or a power started the universe, something started the universe in the path that we're currently on. And whether it's the Big Bang or whether it's this force, you could call it God, you could call it random chaotic energy, whatever it is, something started it. And whatever you choose to believe is your fundamental assumption, right? Because we're just building off all of our philosophy off an assumption. Something was there. And either of those ideas are equally either probable or improbable. And so we got to start with one of those. So as humanists, we start with this idea that kind of in the beginning there was chaos. And out of chaos, one probability emerged. And that probability was the universe. And the Big Bang happened and things expanded over time. So one of the big questions is, well, how did something as complex as us come to be? If you know a little bit about physics, you know that you kind of start with the basic elements. They've just got a couple of pieces to them each. A couple of small pieces, protons and electrons, and you get helium, you get hydrogen. And then over time, stars burn those things, and then create the heavier elements up to iron, nickel. And then things like supernovas create even heavier elements, and those things get dispersed throughout the universe to then become the planets and the solar systems and the variety of things that are throughout the universe. And then those things kind of congeal together into clumps, and those clumps form a little bit more complex patterns. Even at kind of the very, very basic level, those complex patterns are things like crystals. Right? Crystals are just certain elements which are made up of a couple of molecules, but they pattern on top of each other to create something a little bit more complex. And over time, more probabilities take place, and sometimes things work out and sometimes things don't work out. But eventually you get to the point where something as complex as a single cell emerges, or algae, or whatever it is, more complex atoms and molecules. And those things can replicate over time, right? And so we get to this point where, much like the story of Goldilocks and the Three Bears, everything is just right. Now again, going back to our fundamental assumptions, this could be a design, I tend to think not, or it could be the random emergence over trillions of years of a particular pattern. And so as this pattern continues to emerge and continues to grow, it becomes more and more complex, which is kind of the opposite of entropy, right? Entropy tends towards simplicity and chaos. So when we build this pattern, and they stack on top of each other and in just the right places, such as where we are today, we end up with something as complex as ourselves. And so if you think about it, this is essentially like an experiment, right? So all of the matter in the universe happens, and it happens all across the universe in a variety of different conditions, much like you would do a science experiment at home with your kids. And eventually, one of the conditions is just right for the outcome that you would want, or happens, just so happens to fit those conditions happens. And we get evolution, and we get humans, and we get ants, or plants and animals. Ants too. Ants are one of the animals, so that works out. But that's what it is. So it's a probabilistic thing. And if it's not something that's designed, it's not something that has necessarily inherent value. It's not something that has an inherent purpose. And so a little bit of the why that we're here is that there is no why. So the how we can explain, but the why is a little bit up to us to decide. And so that can be often a frightening thing, that there is no ultimate purpose, inherent purpose, other than what we choose, which is also a liberating thing. So if the purpose for us is something that we end up choosing, I think it's kind of important that we spend a little bit of time on what that should be. And so that's not something that, any of us can just come out and say, well, clearly this is the purpose. And so we have to look at, let's look at our existence. What are the kind of conditions that are conducive for it? And then where do we want to go, right? You always chart your course by where your end state is, or where your goal. And so, we talk about probability, and we get to this point where existence happens. And so, it goes back to one of the old ideas from philosophy long ago is, I think, therefore I am. Right? So we are now, and we think, and we can recognize that we have a self. So we know that we exist, right? And so from there, we know that we have awareness. And awareness is kind of where you get that sense of self, and where you can start to do things like imagine. You here for the service? Come on in, please grab a seat. Thank you. And so we're at I think therefore I am. So that should kind of tell you everything you need, right? So I think therefore I am, and then so we have this sense of awareness, and this sense of awareness can be simply described as imagination. So not only do we sense what's around us, but we can also imagine what's around us. We can simulate what's around us, right? And that's kind of what adds to our complexity. And it allows us to build our own complexity versus having our complexity built from the outside. So one of the analogies that people use for this is kind of the difference between hardware and software. Hardware kind of have to change from the outside, but software can be updated internally. So we have a software that's kind of strong enough to be able to simulate and improve upon itself. That allows us to bend the world to our will a little bit and then figure out where it is we need to go. So when we do that, we can also run simulations on interactions, right? How do we interact between each other? And how do we do the things that promote our own survival? Let's go back and look at where we are. So to exist, we need to have some certain basic conditions. And we want to do something that's basically, you could describe it as maximizing optionality or maximizing options, right? So if you're a human, you want to have some redundancy, right? You don't want to be starving each day, and any day that you don't get food, you're gone, right? You want to have a little bit built up. You want to have a little bit of fat stores. You want to have some food in the fridge that you can provide for that sustainability. You want to have people you can rely on, because as humans, when you think about it in terms of nature, we're actually pretty fragile. And so having more of us allows us to continue our existence, family units, right? Those sorts of things. And so when we think about those things, we realize that people know that we're social creatures, of course, but that's for a purpose. Not just because we are, but because it actually helps our survivability. And so with that, internally we have morals, right? We kind of describe morals as, that's your internal right and wrong. So you know for yourself that hurting yourself is wrong because it goes against your ability to exist, right? And you know that feeding yourself is good because it continues that right to exist, right? Or that ability. So that's morals, that's individual. But what about when we come up against somebody else? What if we have actions that might clash for whatever reason? If I take their food, right, it's wrong for them, but right for you. So how do we deal with that? That's where we get into what we would call ethics, right? Ethics are the things that we agree on between each other, right? So we come together and we say, well, that's wrong, you took my stuff, but it's right for me because I need to eat. And then we figure out, well, maybe if we work together, we figure out that sharing is a good thing. Well, sharing is good because then we both survive, and then we have redundancy. We have someone to rely on. And so we can build that into a tribe or a community or whatever it happens to be. And so we build these ethics over time, and we figure out through situations, either through experience or through that simulation, that ability that we have to think through something that hasn't yet happened, and then figure out, okay, I think in this situation, this would be a good rule to follow. And then everybody agrees to that, and that becomes an ethic. So laws, then, are simply ethics that have been written down. Right? Over time, the ethics get pretty complex. Our society is full of very complex ethics. Stop signs, right? Stop signs are not inherently right or wrong, but they have become an ethic that helps promote overall safety and survivability. It goes back to kind of the core piece of promoting our own existence. And so the law is just a system of recording ethics. Now, a lot of times when we get too complex, of course, we have laws that conflict or ethics that conflict, and then we have systems in place to resolve those conflicts, whether it's the courts or arbitration or whatever it happens to be, communication or conflict communication. But that's kind of how we build up from the very basic building blocks of life up to morality, ethics, law, and options. And so there are some questions that people often ask. Is it right to lie or wrong to lie? Is it right to kill or wrong to kill? Should self-harm be a thing that's allowable? Should be allowed to end your own existence? And so we want to explore some of those kind of as examples of what it means to exist in this space, because these are all ideas, right? And it sounds great on paper that, oh, ideally this would happen or that would happen, but what's the reality look like? So, to lie, right? So let's say you don't want to go to work today because you have something that you feel you have a need for, right? But you've got sick days, right? And you say, well, I'm going to use one of my sick days. I'm not really sick, but I know that for me, this is going to maximize my optionality. Is that right or is that wrong? So I would say, looking at the situation, that's right. When we start with the basis of I think, therefore I am, we can only know ourselves best, right? It's very difficult for someone to know all of the motivations and all the factors we have in our head. And so we have to advocate kind of for our own well-being, and then beyond that for our family's well-being and for our community's well-being. And so if we look at a given situation and we look at all the ethics along with the internal morals that we have, and we say, I think in this situation this makes sense to do. I think it makes sense to call in sick. Because maybe I'm not sick, but my kids are sick, or they need something done, or I need to do something for the household, and this is just the thing that makes the most sense. Then yes, it makes sense to break that rule, that ethic that's written down, because it makes sense in the long run for you, your family, your community, etc. Should you kill? Right? Generally, no. Not just because it violates someone else's morals, but because it also violates the system of ethics that we've built for society. Right? It undermines the trust that we have in others. So we're all in this room today. If we didn't have sort of a basic underpinning understanding that we don't hurt each other, we would all be on guard. We would not be able to have this level of conversation and engagement in community, because we would all be looking at the other people, preparing to defend ourselves. Right? But there are circumstances, of course, where you would take action, and you might kill somebody else, right? So self-defense is a classic example, right? If you're defending your family, right, you know that this person obviously has violated the ethic, right? And so making quick decisions, they might not be someone who is kind of good for the long term of humanity, because they're clearly trying to harm you and your family. And so you might have to take action that wounds them or does kill them, right? So there are examples of when to do that, but generally it doesn't make sense. And then there's self-harm. This one's very complicated and a little bit hard to figure out. Sort of the basic answer is no, of course, right? Because eliminating yourself eliminates your optionality, right? Your optionalism, if you want to call it that. You no longer have options after that point. You have no options to improve anything, and so when you're reflecting on your situation, it would have to be something where it appears within all of the understanding that you have, and after great amounts of reflection, that your best option is that one. Right? Not to say that it's something we should ever advocate for or institute as a mandatory rule for people who are in bad circumstances, but it's something that individuals would have to consider. And with all of this, reflection, understanding, and knowledge are absolutely critical. Right? We build these ethics over time. These ethics have been built over millennia of human interaction. And there is wisdom in that timeline. And there are some things that are conflict. But having a greater understanding can only better inform how we build our ethics and our morals for ourselves. And we have to go back over time and refine them. So in the circumstance that someone is considering self-harm, they need to really ask themselves and try and find perspective in whatever that happens to be. And say, is this really the worst that I could be dealing with right now? Is there something that I can be grateful for in this instance? Is there something that I can look at and fit in further humanity, whether my own, my family's, my community's? Or is it something where there are people who their life is suffering for usually physical reasons, sicknesses that are debilitating, where I could understand after great amounts of reflection and time with their family, they could make that decision. So like I said, that one is a very difficult example to think through or situation to consider. But by and large, for most part, I would say that most people haven't really reflected on their circumstances enough to make that decision with a clear mind. Because there is much good in the world, and as we talked about last week in our talk about happiness, perspective, and gratitude, happiness is a practice. It's not something that automatically happens. And while many of us can be sad from time to time, those times of sadness help build us and help us establish a baseline for what happiness really looks like. And we'll talk about it later today. I'll stop this recording and do another one since the audio went out last time, so those who are here are welcome to stay for that. So the key thing when we're deciding anything, so those were 3 examples that kind of asked or answered some of the basic questions that people have about ethics and morality and social interaction. But kind of the basic thing is don't limit your options. When you're making decisions, really think about your circumstances, your community, your family. If you can hold it in your head and understand it well enough, think about the world, the impacts to the world. It's to things like environmentalism or having a civil society. Like those things are beneficial for us as individuals as well as the community as a whole. But that's the key thing, don't limit your options. Right? So in the day-to-day interaction, if someone's being mean to you, you feel the desire to be mean back or to be petty, right? But the way I see it, that wouldn't make sense, right? That limits your options. That's something we would consider burning a bridge, right? So we wouldn't burn that bridge because that limits our optionality in the future. Or it makes it so that we have to invest a lot more energy to rebuild that option. And when it comes to things like eating healthy and not smoking or taking care of yourself and taking care of your family, you want to maximize that optionality, right? You want to extend your life as much as possible. You want to make the lives of your families and your community better. And so considering what increases their optionality is also good. And so when it comes down to it, a lot of these rules should help to reinforce the behaviors that promote our well-being and promote our existence. And when we reflect on, do I really want to eat this healthy food or do I want to eat this fatty snack cake? I do love me some fatty snack cake, so I understand, right? But can we do that in balance, right? Can we balance all of those things? And if we establish those rules as habits, then those things become easier for us. And they become easier for our families. And they become easier for our communities so that we are increasing our optionality. We're not limiting ourselves through heart disease or lung cancer, right? That we're building healthy societies, that we're building good family structure, that we have people to rely on, right? And so that's kind of the basic pieces of building a framework of ethics and morality. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we do next time. There are a couple of little pieces that I want to hit on. One of them is free will. So when we talk about complexity, and we talk about imagination, right? So the ability to be aware of yourself. That's a fairly complex thing. But you can only imagine systems that are a little bit less complex than you, right? As soon as you approach your own complexity, you can't hold the whole complexity in your head because you are that complexity. Sounds kind of complicated, but it's like running a computer simulation of the world, right? To run a computer simulation of the world, you would need the world to run the simulation, to make it perfect. But you can reduce the complexity of the simulation, say it's the weather, right? So they predict the weather based on a few assumptions and running certain data points. They don't run every molecule of air in the world, because that would take the world to simulate, right? And so, therefore, we can only really consider ourselves are less complex. So we don't know if we have free will, because that would require us to be more complex than ourselves, to then look at ourselves to say, oh, well, they clearly do or do not have free will. So we can't know if we have free will. That means we have to make an assumption. So the assumption that we kind of base our action on is that we do have free will, right? Society, the way we've constructed it, is based on free will, that you have the ability to choose. If you didn't have the ability to choose, there would be no point in having ethics or laws, because everything would be preordained, right? They would be purely driven by the environment, purely driven by genes, and I don't think any of us consider that to be true. Besides which, if you get to the practical matter, it doesn't work. Society doesn't work when people believe that free will does not exist. Because then you could do anything and say, well, it was preordained or it wouldn't have happened, right? And society could break down at that point because people aren't interacting as if everyone had free will, and if you have the ability to make choices to either make your life better or worse. So I wanted to throw that out there just as a bit of a concept. So free will is something that we assume we have, can't prove it, but it's something that's fundamental to the way we have designed society and we function as humans in making choices. And then I wanted to go a little bit into ethics. So we'll get a little bit academic, so we'll go back to Aristotle, right? So Aristotle has his system of ethics, which he calls virtues, right? And virtues are not something that kind of float in a vacuum, but they are a balance between two excesses, right? Humility, right? Humility actually is not an Aristotelian virtue; it's a Christian virtue, and particularly in the way that it's that manifests today. But humility in Aristotle's time would be called magnanimity, right? The magnanimous man. So it's basically someone who is neither a braggart who brags about themselves all the time, nor is it someone who puts themselves down and says that they're not very good at things, right? It's somewhere in the middle, that you know what you're good at, that you value what you're good at, but you also wouldn't say that you're good at everything or good at things that you are not good at. So this idea of balance appeals to me in particular, but it's not the answer. It is an answer. It is a framework to look at ethics and morality, right? I like it because to me it's intuitive. It makes sense, right? So this balance between things. When it comes to bravery, right? So on one side you have foolishness, right, or recklessness, and on the other side you have cowardice, right? Neither of those things are good for optionality, but balance in the middle is what you would call courage. And so when you go down the list, and you can look up Aristotle's virtues, it's in his book Nicomachean Ethics, just search Aristotle and virtues and you'll find it. And there are some different ones in there, and there are different ways to consider the different virtues or categories kind of he puts things in. But I think it's a good framework for us to consider because balance, moderation is something that really, I think, helps us maintain optionality, right? When it comes to, let's say, combat or fighting, right? One of the things you want to do in there is maintain balance with your body because it preserves your ability to move in any direction, to counter things. So in life, you want to be postured with balance because it maintains your ability to choose options that are most advantageous for you in a situation. And then the golden rule. It's one that we know, treat others as you would like to be treated. And it's basically kind of the overarching ethic, right? There is no rule that says how we're going to act in every situation, right? That would be far too complex. We would do nothing but memorize rules all the time, much like a computer would have a set of instructions. But if you have something outside of those instructions, you're unable to make a decision. So if in doubt, go back to the golden rule. And what that does is it doesn't necessarily preserve optionality for you in the short term. So it might be something where you have to deal with an idiot who's not being respectful or not maintaining balance in their virtues. But in the long term, it means the societal balance and optionality because we continue to be civil, right? And so that's what the golden rule really does. Treat people well because you would want to be treated well. And that will maintain our optionality as a whole. And so that was a very fast-paced breakdown of how we establish ethical frameworks in society, kind of from the Big Bang. We're going to post some additional documentation on this one because it's something that really requires some thinking, looking at the words and thinking about the frameworks of how we understand how we come to be. And again, none of these things are the answer. For me to stand up here and say I have the answer is honestly a bit silly and would be a bit prideful on my part and definitely make me a braggart in terms of my magnanimity. But this is simply a framework that allows you to consider a consistent way to build an ethical framework, a way for you to live your life that is consistent and doesn't necessarily require belief. It does require a fundamental assumption, right? The Big Bang happened and elements exist because of that chain reaction. But it seems that it's a pretty reasonable assumption to start with. So with that, thank you all for coming today. We'll close this video out and we'll go back and we'll re-record the happiness, perspective, and gratitude. So thanks very much.